I would like to start the interview with a question related to democracy. The form of democracy we see in the West is a representational democracy where we get to elect officials about every 4 years who then take all decisions on our behalf. I would be interested in your opinion if this form of democracy could or should be improved in a way that gives the population the ability to make a more direct decision, for example through referendums, because with the internet this would be a lot easier to do from a technical perspective. Especially in Europe, referendums are not very popular with the political elite, since the population doesn't seem to know how to properly vote in accordance with the European political agenda. So what is your take on this subject?
Okay, well, I think just calling what we have in the West, and particularly I can speak most about in the United States, a democracy, is kind of bending the word democracy about as far as it can be bent without breaking it all together. Representative government is a really good idea, but the representation is kind of thin and more indirect than direct. And at least in the US, and probably true all over, the real force, I guess force is the right word, behind legislation and policy and the kind of things that governments decide typically is a collusion or cooperation between government and industry. Not so much government and the people. I think typically in any organization or of any sort, power goes to resources. Who has the resources is who has the power. Now we can make arrangements such that it doesn't look so much like that, but if we look at actually what's going on and why things are done the way they are, I think we'll see that that old formula about power follows resources. If you want to know who's in charge, follow the money. That's typically what's been said. Money speaks louder than people's voices. So I think that's true. And in our system, probably even more true than it is in other Western systems. We have things called PACs, where organizations are set up just to influence government. Those PACs, lobbyists, spend billions of dollars to make sure that what suits them is what ends up in legislation. How can a citizen compete with that? So I'm not sure we have a democracy. It's more like an oligarchy, wherein business, and not just business, but wealth in general, whatever that represents, mostly in our culture that represents business, commercial interests, corporations. They have a lot of leverage and say in the government, more than really the people do. On the other hand, representative government, democracy, has one very, I shouldn't say strict, but a kind of requirement that just can't be gotten around, and that is that you have an informed, intelligent electorate. If you don't have that, then democracy starts to not mean anything. If the electorate is not informed and capable of making good, critical thinking. Well, in our electorate, that's obviously not the case. We grow up in a culture that has a public school system whose main objective seems to be to teach children to sit down and be quiet. There's one teacher for 30 children, and sit down and be quiet is about all that teacher can enforce. Anything you might learn on the side is, is kind of extra, because with one person in charge of 30 children, discipline and sitting down and being quiet is probably about 80% what the teacher needs to accomplish first, because without that, then there really is no learning. And if that takes 80% of your time, then teaching is not really spending a lot of time teaching, spending more time babysitting than teaching. And we have the attitude within the school system that critical thinking, creative thinking, thinking outside the box is all punishable. You not only sit down and be quiet, but you regurgitate what it is I tell you to regurgitate. It's more of a memorize and go on, which really has nothing to do with learning. It has to do with indoctrination. So just calling ourselves a democracy is stretching things a little bit. We have a population that does not have critical thinking skills. Those skills were squished through the first 6 or 7 years of public education. So it's a problem, how we govern ourselves. Also, there was a time probably, 50, 60, 75 years ago, maybe 100 years ago, when most all politics was local. And that is because we didn't have mass media. You go back 100 years, yes, you probably had a radio, but that was about it. And without mass media, almost all your issues and all the things you know about are local. Well, that's not true anymore. Now people spend probably 5 or 6 hours every day plugged into mass media. And if you start with a given that those people do not have the capacity to think critically because that was punishable, then indoctrination, propaganda, finds a very fertile home in that kind of an environment where you can bombard people for hours and hours and hours with whatever attitudes you'd like them to have. Another thing that mass media has given us in the political arena is the idea that we have lots of people, let me back up and start differently. We have lots of people in our culture who would like to control others. These are people who are trying to sell things, whether it's a political idea or a new soap, a product, doesn't matter. There are the legal system, the political system, mostly religious systems, marketing systems, all want to control the opinions of people. And the one most surest way to control another person is through fear. Fear is a big handle on the back of the fearful by which the person who can manipulate that fear can pretty much get that person to dance to any tune that he'd like, just by working with that fear. So once that was understood how that worked, and in conjunction with mass media, we have a culture in which the drums of fear have just been beaten and beaten and beaten about everything. Look at all the advertisements that come on, use this product, or, there's these awful consequences if you don't. Drink this beer or the girls won't like you, silly stuff that if you looked at it intellectually, it would seem completely ridiculous, but it's not working at an intellectual level, it's working at an emotional level. And the people who understand fear and propaganda know how to work at that emotional level. They work on that very, very well. So we add all that together, and now let's discuss the meaning of democracy. You see, what is a democracy in this modern world, particularly in the Western world? Well, it's not at all like the Greek republics, or even the Roman Republic in its early days. It's not that way. But in your question, you mentioned something very interesting, and that is the internet is a game changer here. Okay? The internet will allow individuals to be represented directly one day. We're not there yet. And of course, the people who are invested in the status quo, those who want to create fear handles, on the population, those who are at the positions of power, they would like that not to change. They would like the status quo to continue. So it's not going to be a change that's going to happen quickly. But now we have the potential that, yes, these referendums that used to be terribly unpopular because they were so much trouble, actually, getting a vote out to millions of people is very expensive, very time-consuming, and you only end up with a fraction of the people anyway, because of people's schedules. Some people are away on travel, just lots of things. People don't understand the issues very well. But with an internet, that doesn't have to be that way. With an internet, you have a media for communication and a media for voting right on the internet. Simple. You don't have to go stand in line, at 6 o'clock in the morning before you go to work. You can just vote from your computer on your desktop whenever you want to. And you have plenty of time to sit there and read through the arguments on either side. Also, the internet provides education in a way that the schools don't. Exposure to so many things other than just the right answer that you're supposed to memorize. So people are learning more thinking skills, critical thinking skills. Even video games require critical thinking skills. Even if you're just a 13-year-old boy trying to shoot their way out of some kind of monster set, that requires critical thinking skills. There's things you have to consider. There's ways you have to move. There's strategy. There's process. Those are starting to grow. So just the internet being there, having all of the information that internet has, is increasing critical thinking skills. When you're only fed one thing, well, there's not much critical thinking going on. But when you have 100 things that are all conflicting with each other, it requires critical thinking skills. So just the deluge of data that the internet throws at us requires critical thinking skills. So I have a lot of hope that things will get better. And I think the internet is a core part of that solution. But only, of course, if the internet stays open and free, so that all voices can be heard equally on it. So I think maybe over the next some decades, maybe next century, who knows, I think we will take a turn toward actual democracy more than nominal democracy that we have now. So I'm hopeful that it will get a lot better, but I don't think we are at all a democracy in the way that we would like to be. That the people basically own and run the government. That's the concept in a democracy. But that doesn't work unless they're informed and can think critically. And we don't have any of that. So we're a long way off from where we ought to be. And hopefully we'll struggle and get more back to where we want to be. But things have a tendency to get worse before they get better, because the power structure as it is will fight very hard to maintain the status quo. And the power structure as it is who has most of the power. So that change of who holds the reins of power is something that doesn't just change easily. Those who have it want to keep it. So those changes will take time.
Okay, I have one related question. What can you tell us about common political systems in other virtual realities you are aware of? And what is the relationship of the average level of consciousness of the population with the way social and political decisions are being made in these societies?
Okay. The first part, I'm not that aware of political systems and other virtual realities because I tend to visit or stay for a short time and revisit at various times, but in order to really be aware of the political system, you kind of have to live there and be in it, which I don't do much. I suspect that they are, in the particulars, very different, but in the generalities, they're probably much the same. And that's because consciousness is much the same. Free will is much the same. The quality of consciousness is much the same. Some places lower, some places much lower, some places a little higher. But because of consciousness being kind of the fundamental thing there, that's kind of the root of where all this comes from. And because you have free will, which means you'll have people evolving negatively, people evolving positively, good decisions, bad decisions, people wanting to control and force others, etc. That's just the nature of consciousness in its evolution. And once you have that, then in general ways, the politics are probably all about the same. They're probably not all that different. Now, the second part of your question, tell me that again.
What is the relationship of the average level of consciousness of the population with the way social and political decisions are being made? Okay,
that's a very good question. The social institutions that we have, including political institutions, corporate institutions as well, really all of our institutions, whether they are love-based or fear-based, they all represent the average or typical quality of us, of the people that make up that system. So you have a system, and tomorrow we'll call that system a culture. You have a culture, which is basically a system that is created by individuals who have an intent to belong to that culture. And that culture will develop in a way that is an accurate representation of the average quality of consciousness of its membership. So if we don't like what we see, if we look at our political landscape and our social landscape and our economic landscape, and if we see unfairness, if we see greed and force and power at work, that's because that's the way we are. It's just the way we are. And if we were to have the power to reach out and change it, all right, let's get rid of this government person and put in somebody else. Let's eliminate the way corporations can influence legislation. Let's make laws and eliminate that. We can do things like that, but those are all symptom relievers. They're all symptomatic. You see, it's not the person that's in the chairman's position. It's not the fact even that corporations can influence legislation. Those are symptoms of a low quality of consciousness system. And if you change those things, they may make a small difference for a while, but in the long term, it'll all go back just the way it was. Once you change the rules, people will find a way to circumvent those changes, to get around them, to work under them. And you change them again, and eventually they'll find ways to work around them. Because people will be who they are, and they will always manifest what they are, the quality that they have. So rearranging organizations, rearranging politics and economics and so on, changing the way the money system works, making rules, really won't change anything that's fundamental in the long term. It just isn't effective. It's like a Band-Aid, makes it feel better. It might make the system a little kinder and gentler for a while until the real system lying underneath, which is all the people in it, re-express their quality in some other way. So many people have this idea that everything would be perfect if we could just change this, if we could add these laws, get rid of those laws, get rid of our leadership, put in new people. It won't make any difference. Within a generation or two, it'll be back just exactly the way it was if nobody's growing up in the meantime. The only way to change those things fundamentally, which means the change stays in the long term, is for the people that make up the system to grow up, to increase their quality. It's the only thing that will work. There is no other solution that will work in the long term. Everything else is like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It might make it look nicer, but in the big picture, that's kind of irrelevant. And that's the way it is with most of our politics and laws and leaders, and all of the things we'd like to change might help a little bit in the short term, but in the long term, they won't do much. I mean, look at us now. Look at humanity. We are now, compared to our human forebears of, say, 1,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, we are civilized. We're polite. We get along. We're cooperative. But that civilization that we so highly regard is just a thin veneer on top of what we were thousands of years ago. You scrape off that veneer, and it doesn't take much to do that, just some kind of real tough situation where people have to react. You'll find that what's under that veneer hasn't changed for millennia. It's still about the same. But we act better now. We're more polite now. We give each other more room and more consideration now. But when things get tough, or things get desperate, all that just disappears, because it's just on the surface. It's just thin. It's not really who we are. We're not much different than we were many, many, many years ago. We just act a little differently. But acting isn't the point. It's being is the point. And most of our civilization is acting. Ways that we learn to behave, but not necessarily an expression of a higher quality of consciousness. Now, our consciousness quality has been growing steadily, and it is getting better, but it's a very slow process. It's not a quick process. We are better than even 200 or 300 years ago in the way we treat each other. More civilized, but again, we've learned to act better. That's nice, but it's not fundamental.
Okay, I have actually a question that matches perfectly your last sentence you said. I've often heard you refer to political leaders as being a representation of the state of consciousness of the overall population. Could you give us a brief evaluation on how the presidents of the United States since John F. Kennedy leading up to Donald Trump go together with, well, hopefully a rise in consciousness in the population?
Well, looking at a change in consciousness in the population, generally have to look over a pretty long time span to see it. But in the U.S., I've seen some changes, and I think some of them have been real changes. And one of the things that I guess I would point at would be race relations in the U.S. When I was growing up, when I was a young person, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, there were separate restrooms for black and white. Blacks rode in the back of the bus. Blacks didn't sit at the same tables in a restaurant as whites did. There was a lot of obvious racism going on everywhere, very open. There was no sense of the general public that there was anything wrong with that. The general public, well, that's just the way it was. That's the way it is, and that's the way it should be, and there was no sense of that even being a problem. No awareness. Then came the 1960s. And in the 1960s, all of that started to change. A lot of the credit would go to Martin Luther King. But a lot of that started to change. And Martin Luther King was successful because in his mind it wasn't about race. It was about quality of the individual. He didn't separate things out by race. He separated things out by what was moral and what was immoral, what was right and what was wrong for everybody. And that was very powerful. So we did go through changes, and all of the things I just mentioned all changed. They all disappeared. All of those trappings of racism went away. It got to be kind of a sign of having, being subpar if you voiced any kind of racist comments rather than being normal. You know, people who said things that were racist, everybody else kind of looked down at them like there was something wrong with them. So it got to be a negative in our culture, whereas before it was neutral. Racism was just, it just was, and now it just was wrong. And that was a big change, a huge change. So I'd say, yeah, there was a lot of growing up doing there. But we've seen now, if we move from Kennedy, where a lot of that race awareness was developed in his term, and afterwards, we see as Trump comes in, that a lot of that more polite, less racist behavior was pretty superficial. That there were a lot of people, not the majority, not as many as there were before. Whereas before the whole culture thought racism was normal, because that's the way it had always been. Now it's a smaller, 20%, 30%, something like that. So it's a whole lot less than it was. But a lot of those same old feelings are still bubbling away down underneath the surface. The only thing that Trump did is he made it so that people could voice the way they felt rather than keep their mouths shut and pretend otherwise. So the closet racist, if you will, the one that had all those racist feelings but knew that if he opened his mouth everybody would look down at him and think that there was something wrong with him, now he could speak up because suddenly it was okay to be racist again, you see. So Trump didn't create anything that wasn't already there. He just gave it voice and made it to where it could bubble up to the top in clear view. And I would think that in a lot of ways that's a good thing. You know, things that fester unseen tend to last longer and are more insidious than stuff that's obvious that you can see it. So I think this thing we're going through now with Trump, where a lot of racists and other not nice attitudes are kind of bubbling up into the public view, I think that's kind of good. We needed to get that out. We needed to see that that was down there and not pretend that it wasn't just because you couldn't see it. It didn't express itself. Now it's expressing itself. All right, those ideas are back on the table, you see, for discussion and understanding and growth. And that's a good thing in the long run, that people need to be authentic. They need to be who they are. And only by being who they are do they have an opportunity to change and to serve as lessons, good examples or bad examples, for the rest of us. So I think all that's probably in the long term going to be an advantage, not a disadvantage. Festering out of sight is not, on the process of changing. Getting up where everybody can see it makes us rethink and reevaluate. So I think that part's good. But yes, there's been change. We're not anywhere near the state of an acceptance of racism that we were in the 1950s or 40s. We didn't backslide. It's not like, oh, it's just like the bad old days. It's not at all like the bad old days. Black people have made huge gains. They're very much seen in the majority of science as just people with different skin color, and that's of no consequence. It's made a huge gains from the 60s until now. And I don't think those gains will ever go away. People change. People grew up. They just never thought about it. If you grow up in a racist culture, you don't think about it as being racist. It's just the way it was. And the 60s got people to look at it and say, whoa, yeah, this is what we're doing, and that's not so good. Whereas before, they just didn't think about it because that's just the way it was. So that's what Trump's going to do. He's going to get a lot more people thinking about it, that we're just kind of gliding along, not thinking about it. And it'll turn out to be a positive thing in our growth in the long run. And it's also true about the awareness and the critical thinking. I think the U.S. is going to learn a rather big lesson in what happens if there is no critical thinking going on. So people will take note of that. And it's always good to let your ugly stuff come up to the top where everybody can see it, because then you have a chance to learn, outgrow it. Otherwise, you'll probably never outgrow it.
Okay. Next question, again on political leaders. If a very materialistic political leader suddenly experienced a shift in consciousness which opened him up to spirituality and changed his actions to being more compassionate, wouldn't this actually cause a problem because he would no longer be a reflection of the average population? Might such a shift in personality and actions, even if they are actually positive, still be the reason that something happened to that leader which removed him from office simply because he diverted too much from being a reflection of the average citizen?
Yes, that's, we're now talking about taking practical, being practical, as well as we exist at a practical level as well as a, I don't really say theoretical level, but we are who we are inside, but we interact with other people. If you're going to interact with other people, you need to take into consideration where they are. This idea that interaction is, well, here's the way I am, I'll just tell you how I am, and you have to deal with that, or you have to understand it, or it's up to you to figure out to get up to the point where I am, or down to the point where I am. And that's really not the way to help or be part of the solution. To be part of the solution, you don't say, well, here I am, I'm evolved and you're not, just be like me. That's not helpful to anybody. Matter of fact, it's just the opposite. That turns people off, pushes them in the wrong direction. You have to be where they are. You have to see reality through their eyes and their feelings. And then you can do something that helps them grow, maybe just a little bit. Take a step in a more positive direction, just one small step. And then let that integrate itself into that person. And then take the next small step. That way you can be of help to somebody who's growing up. So if you were in politics and you were right in the thick of things and suddenly you understood, say, spiritual values and big picture thinking and saw reality as it was, saw the kind of the corruption and the negativeness of what it is you were doing and the system you were in, it would not be helpful at all to just say, wow, I just can't be here anymore, I gotta go. Okay? That would be very self-centered. It's all about you. You're not comfortable there anymore, so you leave. A better thing to say is, how can I help this system grow up? How can I help all the people around me see a bigger picture, like I've found? How can I do that? And going out and explaining it to them is not the thing to do. See? The thing to do is realize what the system you're in and take what steps you can to nudge that system in a more positive direction. That's as much as you can do. Anything more than that, you'll push it in the opposite direction. See? Once you shake your fist at somebody and say, you're wrong, you're immoral, you don't have the big picture, you've just made them go deeper into whatever picture they did have, because now they're defensive. That doesn't help. So what you need to do is not put them on the defensive, but build trust and then lead them to a better place, a little bit at a time. Change has to come from the inside. It can't be imposed from the outside. So you're a political leader and suddenly you have a deeper vision of how love is the thing that matters. Walking out would not be the best thing to do. Trying to push other people to see your point would not be the best thing to do. staying in the system and trying to change it from the inside, little by little, would be the best thing to do, you see, because that last one is the only one that'll work. Everything else pushes it in the opposite direction. So that's what a person would do. Working from the inside is 100 times more powerful than complaining from the outside. So if we have good people, spiritual people working on the inside, that will change us much, much more quickly than if all those people drop out and start complaining from the outside, start pointing fingers and saying what's wrong, even if they're completely right. They're more powerful, a more powerful force for change on the inside than on the outside. So they would just have to let people be who they are and encourage them to be better. So most people probably wouldn't notice so much this change, but subtly they would be starting to shift the focus of things, bringing up things, talking about things that matter, and if the majority say, oh no, we don't want to do that, then they'd have to let that go and work at it a little bit more from another direction next time. And eventually they'll make a difference, or at least they will have taken the path that gives them the highest probability of making a difference. And you can't do any better than that.
Okay. My next question. In Western societies, we tend to be very oriented towards being down to earth and realistic about everything. But what role does imagination actually play in our lives? And would we benefit if we found a way to keep imagination of children alive instead of shutting it down as they grow up?
Yes, of course. Imagination is very undervalued in our culture, in Western culture. You know, we see one reality, and that's the physical reality, and everything else isn't real. Your dreams that you have at night, they're not real. They're just dreams. Your inner life is just subjective, mostly nonsense. You're just fooling yourself, tricking yourself into believing that most of this inner life of yours is real. They're really just your opinions of things, and there's nothing substantial there. We have these kinds of attitudes that this physical reality is the real reality and everything else is kind of a secondary, not real. And that's just not so. There are three ways that reality comes to you. There's three different channels for information that you get. Now I'm jumping into the idea that we live in a virtual reality, and that in this virtual reality we receive a data stream, and then we interpret that data stream as our reality. So I kind of skipped all that, but for the viewer who's used to my work, they'll get that quickly. But coming from that perspective, you can get data, a data stream, from the larger conscious system. And that's pretty much what we have here. This virtual reality we live in, we call our physical universe, that's a data stream coming from the computer that serves up this virtual reality. That's from the larger conscious system. You can get data from another individuated unit of consciousness, some other being like yourself. That's conscious can communicate with you. That's what consciousness does, is we communicate with each other. And you can create your own information in your imagination. Those are the three sources that you have: some other IUC, the system itself, or yourself. All three of those sources are as real as any of them. It's not like any one of those sources is more real or more fundamental than the rest. Your imagination is as much real as is this physical universe. It's just information, it's data you get. There's no tag on the data that says this data came from your imagination, that data came from an IUOC, and this other data came from the system. We don't have that. All that data gets mixed up together, and we have to interpret it, pull it apart. And they're all as real. Data's data, and we get to interpret it. Our imagination is really a very powerful tool. It, you can use it to learn. How many people have something they have to do and they're a little worried about it, like give a speech. You have to stand up in front of a lot of people and give a speech. Well, how do you deal with that? You can't just find 100 people to listen to you while you practice giving a speech to 100 people. That doesn't work. You do it in your imagination. You stand up someplace, and you get your notes, and you start your speech to an imaginary audience. And after doing that 20 or 30 times, not only are you much more fluid in your speech, but you're more relaxed because you know you can do this. It's not so scary anymore. So see, that imagination is useful. You can learn things from it, just as much as you can learn things from any other reality. You learn things from your dreams. Your dream is another reality frame in which you get to make choices. From those choices, you either evolve and grow up or you de-evolve. So they're all about the same. So imagination isn't a kind of a fake or a not valid, not real kind of information, kind of data. It's as real as any of it. You can learn as much as you can in any of it. It's very valuable. In fact, this separation we have between the realness of our imagination and the realness of the physical world causes us a great deal of trouble in our understanding the larger reality. Because we immediately, upon, let's say just our intuition, when we get some information intuitively, we immediately judge it. Is that real? Did I just make that up? With the idea that if I made it up, then it's useless and doesn't count. If it's outside of me, then it could be useful. Well, if this comes from inside of you, it could be useful too. Pay attention to that, you see. One's not more or less useful or more or less true or more or less valid than any of the others. So yes, we do our children a great disservice when we squash their imagination. In fact, our whole culture may do children a disservice by pushing them to linear logical processing too early. There's a lot of developmental things that have to take place in a very particular sequence. You have to crawl before you walk. And if you never crawled, you just, were lying down on your back, and when they got up and walked, you'll have some developmental issues because you skipped a step. Because the way your brain develops, the way your central nervous system develops, there's a lot of things depending on a sequence of events happening. And if you disturb that sequence, or don't do it right, or don't do part of it, then that can affect you for a long time. Well, part of the developmental, the development of a consciousness has to do with being born. You have probably 80% soon after birth is still in the non-physical. There's only probably about 20% is here in this physical world. And then that changes the older you get. Somewhere around 2 years old, you probably have about 50% of you in the non-physical, the other 50%'s here. That's when, in 3 and 4 and 5, children that age have non-physical friends. They just seem to know things. They're very intuitive. They can tell how you're feeling without you explaining it to them. They're very intuitive that way. They work with kind of the larger reality as opposed to just within the physical reality. Where they start to change over the logical process is where we teach them to read. That's the first thing. And then we teach them arithmetic. And that's very logical process things. And if we think we're doing our child a favor by teaching them to read when they're 4 years old, so that by the time they get to be 5 and go to kindergarten or 6, they'll be advanced, I'm not sure that that's an advantage. We may have just inadvertently caused them to skip some of their developmental steps of being intuitive, being connected, being right-brained, seeing a big picture. That's an important part of the development. And if we squash that out too early, what we'll end up with is a person that's very left-brain dominant and doesn't have a big picture. Can't see things intuitively. Matter of fact, they deny they even had an intuition. Can't see the holistic nature of things, the connectedness of things. All they see is logical process. They're excellent at getting from A to B and following directions, following prescriptions. But thinking, seeing the big picture, and what do we call that? Getting out of the box, thinking out of the box, being creative, not so good. They don't do that very well. And if you look at our culture, you see that we are very left-brain dominant for the most part, particularly all the people who are, quote, in charge. You know, the doctors, the lawyers, the Indian chiefs, the accountants, the legislators, the people who make our rules for us, you know, the legal system, all very left-brain. It's all a logical process. And when you don't develop a right brain, a holistic process of seeing big pictures, then you're very out of balance. You don't have empathy because you don't really consider other people. You've got your logical process. It's all about you. If I do these things then will happen. And the idea of how does what I do affect others doesn't really occur to you because others is kind of this bigger picture concept. The right brain sees us as a part of a bigger thing. The left brain sees us as within a process of steps. So yes, we have a whole culture that's left brain dominant that has a hard time relating to other people, other places. And that gets in the way. That's not to our benefit. Yes, encourage those children to be imaginative, to be creative, to be intuitive. And let's not force them in the logical process before they've had a chance to develop that other side of themselves. Or we'll all end up one step down the, what do they call it, the autism spectrum, right? Where we're very logical processed, but don't relate very well to other people, or see big pictures, or not inventive, not creative. Don't care too much about that bigger picture, if it exists. We're just locked in here to what has to be done, and how it has to be done at the moment. Yeah, a real big problem. We tend to do that. We push children into logical process, probably before they're ready. And we think we're making them advanced. What we're doing is making them unbalanced. It's not such a good thing to do.
Okay. You once mentioned that a soul might decide not to inhibit the body it originally chose if, due to probabilities playing out, the body they picked suddenly develops some kind of birth defect leading to mental disability. Would it be fair to derive from this reasoning that people with mental disabilities tend to have a higher state of consciousness, even though they might not be able to express that quality on an intellectual level?
No, I wouldn't jump to that conclusion. It's possible that it works like that some of the time, but in general, for most people in the beginning levels of their evolution of their consciousness, they simply log on to a new incarnation, a new body, a new avatar, and when they do, stuff happens. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty in the biological process, a lot of things that could go this way or that way, lots of choices, lots of ways that those chromosomes can match up and make different things happen. Characteristics that haven't been seen for 3 generations, you know, pop out, and you have a kid with red hair in a family that hasn't seen any redheads, you know, for 4 generations. But yeah, there was one 5 generations back. So all sorts of things can happen, lots of uncertainty and probability going on there. And if that happens to produce, say, retardation or mental issues or other kinds of dysfunctional things, then the entity just deals with it, typically, because it's a it's a jump in, jump out for most beings that are on the planet. They die, their consciousness picks another avatar, they jump into it, and they deal with whatever they get. After you've been around that block enough times that it's not just experience that you need, but it's very specific experience, now you do a little more picking and choosing of those situations that are likely to trigger the growth that you need. Because people don't mature or grow up evenly. It's not like all aspects of your personality kind of grow up together. Sometimes this aspect will be real grown up and this aspect will be real immature. So then you can work on that immature, that one that needs help. You can maybe focus on that a while. So that then makes you kind of selective in what your next incarnation would be. But if you're not to that point where you're concerned about an inequality of your growth in the various parts of your personality, then it really doesn't matter. You just need experience. And you jump in and deal with whatever you get to deal with. All that comes later. But it doesn't always work that way. So it's some the way you mentioned, but mostly not. So typically it's just an entity got took that, logged into that avatar, and then they have to deal with it, whatever it is. And that's not so bad. You know, we think about, oh, poor consciousness has to deal with it. You know, some they're born with, you know, one leg or no arms or mental retardation or some other kind of horrible thing. From the viewpoint of the big picture, none of those are horrible things. From the little picture, they're horrible things. From the big picture, they all have their own set of choices. They all have their own ways of learning and growing. They're just different. Just a different set of things. When you are born with no arms, you have a whole different set of choices to make than somebody that's born with arms. And you can grow up just as well, maybe even, you know, maybe even more quickly with some of those horrible, you know, things, because those challenges are a little stronger challenges. How you deal with things, how you relate to people. Instead of just kind of going through like everybody else does and not thinking about it, you have to think about it. You have to make some hard choices and accept things. And you might actually find that some of that is more of a fast track than it is a horrible experience, because it forces you to thinking about relating and people and who and what you are and what's important and what's not. Whereas if you're just average and normal, then you just kind of drift through life without really thinking too deeply about anything. So it's not all disadvantage. It only seems that way in the little picture. You can have valuable choices to make in any situation. It's not about how easy your life is. It's about how much you're able to grow in that life. Is what's important.
Okay. In the first Youth Fireside chat we had last December, you mentioned in one answer that sexuality in general is closely linked to realities with a tight rule set. Did you mainly focus with that statement on the biological reproduction aspect and that it is only necessary in tight rule set realities? Or did you really mean that as soon as we die on the physical plane, the entire subject of sex as well as related energies and emotions is something that we leave behind?
Yeah, both of those. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but some of all of that. The point is that our biology developed as it developed, evolved as it evolved because of the rule set. So we have this rule set, and this is a simulation, and in this simulation, avatars such as ours developed. And in order to succeed in the simulation, they had to survive and they had to procreate. And sexuality is part of that process. So it's a natural process that's part of our avatar's evolution here. And that's because we have a tight rule set. If we didn't have that kind of a rule set, procreation and survival aren't even issues. If you're in a non-physical space where there is no threat to your, to your existence, then survival isn't an issue. It's not important. You're in, and you know, really the procreation is just another aspect of survival. It's not individual survival, but it's survival of the species. Is what the procreation is about. So if you're in a non-physical realm with a very loose rule set, that's just not an issue either. It's not like you're part of a species that needs to survive, but somehow there are dangers out there and you need to evolve in such a way that you can deal with those dangers and your species can continue. Those things only have to do with rule sets that have created those conditions. In many non-physical places, none of that's important. So sexuality and reproduction and survival aren't important either. They're just non-issues. It's nothing there to make that be something that anybody would ever think about, you see. So that's why I tied, you know, the sexuality to rule sets, is through the fact that rule sets create the conditions of the rules in which sexuality is part of the reason why you make choices to survive and to procreate, so the species can survive. So that's really the connection to that. So you don't think in terms of sexuality or survival if you're not in a rule set where that's important.
Okay. I've kept one difficult question or topic for the end of the interview, and it's the topic of sexual abuse. This form of abuse often targets children and is expressed in a very dysfunctional expression of affection in combination with sex and violence. To my knowledge, the psychological viewpoint on this subject is that perpetrators cannot be cured, and that all that can be done is that they learn how to control their impulses and not act upon them. I have two questions in this respect. Why did such a widespread dysfunctional pattern evolve all around the globe when it is so harmful for children? And question number two, is the root cause of this behavior pattern located on a transpersonal level, working as a humanity-wide meme, or is it just an unfortunate dysfunction of the level of the physical brain of the perpetrators?
Okay. The root cause of the problem, of course, is fear. That's the root cause. And fear tends to develop into strategies that our ego uses to deal with that fear. Okay, if we have a fear, then we have ego that helps us deal with that fear. And the ego can just try to ignore it, or it can try to candy coat it, make it seem like it's not such a bad thing. And some of the ways you think it's not such a bad thing, if you say, well, that's not really so bad, yeah, that would be okay, and here's how you justify it, and that sort of thing. So that's what our ego does. It helps us deal with our fears, not really deal with them, but get along with them. Not deal with them in the sense of get rid of them, but deal with them in the sense of keeping them from causing us pain. Well, when you have a lot of fear, as most everybody does in our culture, then these fears, if you don't get rid of them, tend to fester. They tend to grow. When you're in your, teens, you mostly just suppress it. Things that bother you, you just suppress it, your fears. You get along anyway, you ignore it. By the time you're in your 20s and 30s, those fears are now nibbling at your heels. By the time you're in your 40s and 50s, they're even harder to suppress. By the time you're in your 60s, they're really hard to suppress. Fear tends to grow. Yes, you can push it down for a while, but eventually it bleeds through. Eventually your games at dismissing it don't work anymore. You need more and more games, things that are stronger. Well, a lot of our fear in Western society is wrapped around sexuality. Westerners, and particularly we in the U.S., are pretty neurotic about sexuality. We have so much fear wrapped around what is appropriate and what is not, and you know, your relationships with the opposite sex. Sex just takes on huge proportions. It's to the younger people, it's the big mystery that nobody will talk about. You know, it's the adult thing that you'll get to do. So it's glamorized in all our media, you know, our movies, our books, and everything. Sexuality is glamorized, and it's made kind of at the core of everything. Yet at the same time that you see it as the core and this glamorous thing, and it's just the big part of life, it's also don't touch, don't go there. So we get these mixed messages, which just makes us a little crazy. We get kind of neurotic about sexuality. Well, that neurosis is basically fear. We fear that we're inadequate. We fear that, you know, we're not going to do or be or meet our needs. Part of our instincts that we just talked about before, that grow up with the rule set for the procreation and survival, is we have sexual instincts that drive us to procreate. If we didn't have those, humans would have been gone a long time ago. So we have that as a part of our makeup. We have instincts just like any other animal has instincts. And we don't know it, but those instincts drive our action probably about as much as dogs and cats and birds' instincts drive their action. We're not that much different. We're driven by our instincts a lot in our choices, but we just don't admit that. We don't see it. We justify all our choices because we've got the big brain. We can justify things rather than just do them. Anyway, as a person gets older, these fears tend to fester. They get harder and harder to deal with, and they turn from something that you could successfully keep under control to something that's hard to keep under control. And one of the interesting things about sex offenders that you'll find is that you would think that people, humans, at the peak of their sexual drive, which would be from 15 to 30, that's where most of your offenses would be. It would be those people that would be with big sex drives from their instincts. They would be the ones causing most of the trouble. But that's not what we see. That's not where the trouble is. The sex offenders are in their 40s and 50s and 60s. Ages where the sex drive has calmed down a bit from what it was in the late teens and 20s. But yet the behavior is even more driven. It's like, what's up with that? They should be toned down a bit at 65. Well, what's up with that is that fear has been festering and growing. That neurosis has been getting bigger and bigger. The more you try to deny it, the harder it pushes to express itself. Well, and when you were 15 to 30, you could push it down pretty well. But later, it gets harder and harder. The dirt you stuff under the rug and get it out of sight, that lump keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The more you stuff under the rug, pretty soon it's hard to not notice. It gets to where you feel compelled to act on it, to do something about it. So it's kind of our own neurosis, our own mental illness, if you will, our own fears that are wrapped around sexuality that is the root problem. It's the fear. And that our culture is neurotic. To be a good member of your culture, a good member of your society, you have to be a little neurotic when it comes to sex, because we have all of these rules that are not in line with our instincts. We've got all these rules and expectations, and they say be this way, and our instincts say be some other way. And whenever you have that kind of a dislocation, you have a struggle going on, you have stress, you have anxiety, and you have fear. Fear is based around that. You can't just be who you are, you have to be how your culture tells you that you need to be. Well, those fears wear on people and grow, and in some cases become obsessions. You know, a fear that becomes an obsession is like any other fear. It's just one that the person can't stop thinking about, can't let go of, can't push away, can't stick under the rug anymore. So that's why it's such a problem. It's a problem in our societies. I think if you were to go look at societies where sexuality was a normal part of being human, that the cultural requirements and instincts were more or less in line with each other, you probably would find almost no predation. You'd find very little of that. People would be generally well adjusted. They don't have a lot of fear wrapped around their sexuality like we do. So that's part of our problem. And a lot of that we picked up in our culture from religion, created a lot of those problems, prejudices against sexuality. And they come from lots of places, but in any case, that's why that it seems to be an endemic thing now. It wasn't heard of so much even 50 years ago or 60 years ago. People have gotten a little more neurotic in ways, in sexual ways, since then, because our culture has gotten more fast-paced, more stress, more expectations, and all of that just kind of drives people a little nutty because it's not who they really are. So I think that's why we see it, and that's why we see it attached to sexuality, because that's one of the areas where we have a lot of push from our instincts, and at the same time we've got a lot of pushback from our culture, and we have a lot of twisted ideas about male and female in our culture, and all of this kind of adds up together to make people a little neurotic and uneasy, and that just festers at times. So you find that it's the older people who are the main offenders when it comes to sexual abuse. You also will find that there's some sexual abuse in families, you know, between parents and their children sometimes, and that often has to do with these obsessions. It also has to do with power, control, self-centeredness, all the same things that create problems everywhere, create problems there. It's just that the sexual thing stands out for two reasons. One, we have extra pushes and pulls, extra drives and things going on there that makes that kind of a bigger deal. And also because we are so keyed up, or so, what can I say, tense, stressed, focused on sexuality, that it grabs our attention. You know, it's a big, we make more of that news than we do other news, because it hits us and it's, oh no, how awful, how could that happen? What could be going on there? Somebody gets beaten up and all their money stolen, and it's kind of more, yeah, that happens. Don't go outside in the park at night. But the sexual offense tends to hit us at a level where our own fears and issues are, so we react more strongly to that now than we used to. But yeah, it's worse now because our whole culture is a little more stressed now than it used to be. We're going through times of a lot of change. We happen to be on the cusp of major change in our lives and in our cultures. And everybody's just kind of a little up on edge with that. It's very stressful lives we live now compared to, say, 100 years ago, when most of us were out on the land someplace, you know, digging in the ground, you know, for our means of survival. It was hard then, but it wasn't as stressful. That stress takes a toll. And the weak points that pop and get noticed tend to be the ones that are connected to sexuality.
Okay. Well, Tom, thank you very much.
Did we get through all your questions?
We already did. just
Great.
in time. I told you about 1 hour, so we
Yeah,
did it.
that was good. Well, you know how long I take to answer a question, then
Yeah.
you were prepared for that. Good. Good. They were very good questions.
Yeah.
Last time we did an interview, which was when I was at Stuttgart,
Mhm.
I thought you asked very different and interesting questions. So I was looking forward to this because last time I thought, well, those are neat questions. Nobody asked me questions like that.
Yeah, try to come up with something new because I already know all the other answers. So.
Right. You've all heard them more than once. Well, good. I thought they were interesting. I enjoyed that.